It's a great pleasure to welcome you all in and to our dozen contributors to today's symposium titled Wonder Stories. And I know it's going to be a great day. I, like many architects, am a committed fan to futures of various kinds, literary, architectural, filmic, science fiction. Has for a very long time played a part of the conversation in a building like this. And figures like Ken Adam, one of my personal futurist favorites, a fellow named Sid Mead in Los Angeles, who scripted the visual appearance of things like Tron, Blade Runner, and many other universes many years ago. And most poignantly, of course, in the recent passing of J G Ballard, we're reminded that London has been a remarkable setting for images of the future in a place that often spends its time dwelling on the past. As Ballard wrote once, and I think Liam scripted in the setup for this, in a strange way, in the world we occupy now, everything is becoming science fiction. And I think that probably means even more at a time when, after the last decade's spectacular building boom and wave of urbanization throughout the world, and it was really and has been unprecedented for the last 10 or 15 years, the amount of building aiming at the future. As all of that was, if not collapsing, being dramatically reconfigured in recent months, there are obvious ways in which we could say that the future has also become a kind of past quite dramatically. For those of you that know things like the steampunk guys in New York, who have got a great version of the future couched in the appearance of the 19th century, or have read things like Neil Stephenson's version of London in the 18th and 19th century, or Bill Gibson and Bruce Sterling's great novel, The Difference Engine, imagining the 19th century steam-run England as the 21st century. There's been a great kind of tradition of future-past rivalries playing through literature, architecture, and film in recent years. That provides, in a certain way, a kind of context for the event today that's intended quite deliberately by Liam and Jeff as a context beyond just architecture and architectural culture to think about the topic of the future, and we're all very much looking forward to the event today. The symposium has been coordinated by Liam Young, Intermediate Unit 7 here at the AA, with Jeff Menoff from Building Blog in the States. They've put together an absolutely stellar lineup of people across many fields, real geniuses in terms of the future that we know today, and I want to welcome you all to enjoy what I know is going to be a great day. Thank you very much for coming in. I'm going to pass over to Liam Young, who will begin the proceedings.
Thanks, Brett, so much for helping get this gig off the ground. And thank you all for coming in as well. I mean, for an 11 o'clock start at the AA, this is actually pretty impressive. So hang on to your seats, because it will sure to get filled up throughout the rest of the day. And it seems that the great number of kind of punters that we have in through the door today is in a way testament not only to the draw of fantastic lineup of speakers that we have, but also in a way to our affection for our affection that we have for the will to image the future, I suppose. And when I first started thinking about the theme of this event and the possibilities of bringing Jeff in, it was with this in mind, really. I mean, for the last few years, we've really been concerned with the possibilities of the present. The possibilities of the idea to build now, to buy now, the culture of excess that saw us kind of scrambling for projects in Dubai and China, to knock out a wall, to buy next door, to expand and to build. The possibilities of the last few years were about the tangible, the physical, the imminently buildable and the inherently possible. And as we start to kind of reach a time where this fees of pitch eases in a way and the economy of building starts to slow, now seems an appropriate time to start to look forward. The future is beginning to become a project again, and we can start to look for ways that these fictions, these speculative possibilities, can actually be launched with such a force that they begin to find traction. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do today. For in a way, we've always kind of regaled ourselves with stories of speculative tales of days yet to come, from laser beams to starry spaceship skies. we can look back, as Brett was saying, to a history of these fictional futures, and also see reflections of the culture we aspire to, or the depths to which we see ourselves descending. And it's really in these polemic visions that, you know, when we start to furnish these spaces of the near future with objects and ideas that are both fanciful and extraordinary tales, but at the same time are chronicles of the contradictions, flaws, inconsistencies or frailties of the everyday. And is this space in between the real and the imagined, where these sci-fi tales offer the possibility of a distance view or an off-site space from which to survey the consequences of alternate social, environmental and technological futures. So today we're going to hear a range of stories from the near future from an extraordinary list of speakers from different disciplines, both within and outside of architecture. And they will help us to widen the discussion here at the AA, I think, by presenting us with alternative models for another way of working, where projects can become test sites for the deployment of wondrous possibilities or dark cautionary tales of our own architectural imaginings. My partner in crime very much today is, and indeed the co-curator of the event is Jeff Manal, creator of Building Blog, the web portal to the architectural beyond. In many ways needs no introduction, I think, to most of the people in this room. Jeff is also a senior editor of Dwell magazine and is author of the forthcoming Building Blog book, which is due to be published next month, I think. But Jeff is really very much in the tradition of the great collectors. An archaeologist of the present, Jeff obsessively mines the world for fragments of scientific fact, quirks of the everyday, curiosities of the nearly possible, and in a way he stitches and spins these visions into tales of what ifs, why nots, could be's, or hope nots. In the brave new world of Building Blog, everything is content, everything is influence, and perhaps everything is architectural. So with wonder and exploration, Jeff's writings archive all the geological, geographical, physical, and astronomical amassed by the science of the day in a series of speculative but encyclopedic urban stories. So, I'm just going to kind of keep it brief, but let us settle in now to hear some tales of wondrous things as Jeff takes us off the map, down the rabbit hole, and out into the morning light of a day yet to come. So I'll pass you on to Jeff. Thanks.
Cool, thanks, Liam and Brett, and hopefully everything here, if you can hear everything in the back. It's actually it's really exciting to be here. The AA is a school that I've known about for obviously a very long time, and the idea of doing an event here is actually something of a fantasy, so it feels really good to be here, and it's really quite exciting. So thanks to Brett and the school itself, Liam for doing a pretty bang-up job with getting everything together and really taking up the organizational side of all this and sending off the emails and scheduling everything. And thanks, obviously, to coming out and making this happen and being here in the audience. It's also, hugely exciting for me to meet the panelists themselves. I've spoken to Peter over the phone for an interview for the Building Blog book. I've met Jim before. I've never met Warren. It's great to see Ian, etc. And once Victor and Squint Opera and Nick and all show up, or Victor's here. But it's pretty exciting opportunity. So anyway. What I want to do is just give notes, just kind of give a general, maybe conceptual overview of some of the things I think we'll talk about today, and then give sort of my own take, explain my own interest in the idea of science fiction and architecture, and just kind of emphasize over and over that a lot of these points will just come up later. There's going to be open Q&As, there's going to be the opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully there'll also be, during the lunch break, kind of casual conversations that will continue there. So, take notes, be prepared to ask questions if you like, and maybe even, live blog or live tweet the proceedings if you want to. So basically, it sounds like maybe, I don't want to go on too much about Building Blog, but I'll just say that basically what I've been doing with Building Blog for nearly 5 years now is really trying to open up, how can we look at architecture without just saying, this is a new project by Zaha Hadid in Dubai, and this is a new project by Rem Koolhaas, et cetera, and how can we actually look at the sort of almost like conceptual energy that exists behind architecture? How can we look at the actual ideas in the field and the actual possibilities of architecture that aren't just material and aren't just structural and aren't just financial, but really kind of the conceptual or narrative stakes that architecture presents? And so I guess in just sort of the 15 or 20 minutes that I have here to introduce things, it's really kind of the narrative. I come at architecture from the standpoint of a writer. So for me, I really, I guess you could say, use architecture as a narrative resource. As you see a building and you can use that as imagine that not just as an office that you need to construct in West London, but as the setting for future stories or plots or lives or events that might happen there. And how can you speculate then through writing and through really sort of fiction itself, or science fiction, or literature, or even poetry, what a building might do, or the events that a building might frame. And so I want to look at really sort of that line that exists between architecture and I guess you could say fiction before we get to science fiction. And so how does one go from architecture to fiction, or for that matter, the other way around? And the thing that I find totally fascinating about architecture, I want to say architecture today, but perhaps it's just because I'm alive now and this is the architecture culture that I'm aware of. But there's such an incredibly thin line between architecture and fiction. For instance, if you take a project, you can describe it materially. You can say it's made of brick. You can say it's two stories. You can say it's a single-family home. You can describe all the basic things to it. But then if you just go even just like one or two sentences further, you've suddenly gotten into a totally different realm of architectural description. You can say, this house has a roof deck, and on that roof deck, maybe in 2 years, you'll build an outside sort of alcove for conversation, and the owner of the house will meet someone who just got back from an archaeological dig in the Ukraine and just discovered this and this so far and so on. And so basically what you've done is you've, in the space of 2 sentences, you've gone from a building description or an architectural proposal, and you've instantly crossed into, say, an outline of a novel or the beginning of a screenplay or a scenario plan for any number of kind of fictive explorations. And so it seems to me what's exciting about that is that you're always, when you're creating architecture, you're always that close to another genre. You're always that close to another media. You can transform what you've done just sheerly through going a tiny bit further, to have another shot of espresso and just keep on describing your project, and you'll go that much further to getting out of architecture or architecture description itself. So something that I hope that we're going to be talking about today is are the sort of bounds of architectural representation. What does it say if you use a CAD program, or you use Maya to represent an architecture program, or an architecture project, or if you give that project instead to Warren Ellis and ask him to make a description of it? In both cases, you're getting a representation of a building or a representation of architecture, but you've crossed a line in one case, and you've gone into a sort of narrative or a science fictional direction, and that's something that hopefully we'll be talking about today. Another thing that I think is interesting about that then too is that we talk a lot about what do architects do in a down economy. We're in a recession, so what do? You can no longer build that super high rise in Dubai because the funding was canceled, or your parents wanted an extension on their house and you were going to build that extension, but then now they can't afford it because they don't have any money. So what are you going to do? How are you going to afford to make a living? And what I think is cool about architecture, and what I think is really interesting about all this stuff, is that precisely because you're that close to other forms of production, that these other industries, as it were, are available to the architect in a way that I don't think are available to, say, or it's not as easy to cross out of, say, creative writing or anthropology or even, for that matter, engineering into these other fields. And I think that architects are really uniquely positioned to take advantage of the creative dynamism of the field and produce ideas and explore ideas in different genres and media. So if we want to say then that architecture is really kind of constantly on the verge of becoming fiction, or architecture is constantly on the verge of becoming something else, what does it mean then if architecture is constantly on the verge of becoming science fiction? What does architecture have to offer that, say, Formula One racing doesn't have? Or why would we have an event called Sci-Fi and Architecture and not international banking and science fiction, or international banking and architecture? So what is it about sci-fi and architecture? This, again, I think is something that will be coming up all day, but I think at the very least there kind of an ongoing revolution in materials engineering, which I think is quite exciting. Everything from like translucent concrete to, say, living glass to all the other sorts of things that are being cataloged today that pushes a building into a realm of physical possibility that would not have been possible 5, 10, 15 years ago. And something that I think will come up with, especially with the first presentation today, which is Peter Cook from ARCA Graham. These questions are, I maybe as a sort of a young upstart presence in architecture, it's easy to talk about these things as if they're only happening now, as if we're only now having a materials revolution. Suddenly we have translucent concrete. My God, what can we do with that? But the thing is, these material transformations and revolutions are more or less as old as modern architecture itself, let alone 19th century architecture, let alone the introduction of structural steel, let alone ancient mortar, et cetera, et cetera. So our architecture has always been on the cusp of these kind of material revolutions. So hopefully this is something that we can talk about today. You know, is there something particular about the moment where we have an overlap between science fiction and architecture now, or is science fiction and architecture something that goes back 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? And this opens up sort of another sub-theme that I want to talk about, which is what is science fiction? You know, when we say science fiction, do we mean things that started with H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and all the writing that happens after that from up to China Mieville and Ian MacLeod? Or do we mean just sort of a different and more imaginative approach to writing? For instance, can you say that Catholicism is a form of science fiction? Could I say that Islam is a form of science fiction? For that matter, could you go back to, I mean, everything from the Book of Revelation to Greek myth and so on? Where does science fiction end, and is religion that sort of thing? And when people were building Gothic cathedrals, is that science fiction and architecture? Hopefully, this is something that we can talk about today. Or for that matter, Angkor Wat in the Cambodian rainforest. Was that an example of building science fiction? At what point do you cross the line from, say, religious speculation or sheer sort of culture and poetry and so on and history into the realm of sci-fi? So I just want to give a couple examples of what I think are interesting, or why would we be talking about these sorts of things. There's an interview actually in the Building Blog book with Lebbeus Woods, the New York-based kind of a somewhat legendary speculative architect, where he talks about, there's a project of his called Einstein Tomb that was published in, I think it was 1980. It was one of the first pamphlet architecture books put out by Princeton Architecture Press. And just as a side note, he mentions during the interview that they only published 400 copies of Einstein Tomb, which at the time I think is, what's extraordinary about that is that anyone in here who blogs, you'll have, 400 people reading your website is a pretty minimal, that'd be a fairly bad day, I think, in any record. But it's interesting that Einstein Tomb would enter into the canon of architectural history, even though there's only 400 copies of it in existence, as opposed to, say, someone in the audience here who's written a blog post that's been read by 16,000 people over the course of a month. I just think sheer numerically, I think it's really quite interesting what blogs and what writing can do. But that's a parenthetical statement. So anyway, Lebbeus describes reading Rendezvous with Rama, the Arthur C. Clarke novel, where a cylindrical object comes into the solar system from an inexplicably far distance, it's kind of rotating through space. No one knows what it is. It's not designed in the way that we look at things like the USS Enterprise or or let alone the Death Star or any of the kind of like attack ships from science fiction that we have. It's a pure cylinder. And Lebbeus points out that this is the same guy that invented or dreamed up the monolith from 2001. It's just geometry. What does it mean that maybe the most alien thing we can encounter is geometry, just pure geometry coming to us through space? So anyway, Rendezvous with Rama served as a sort of conceptual template for thinking, how could you build a tomb for Albert Einstein? After all, if there's a tomb for Isaac Newton in Boulet's famous cenotaph, and if you can build tombs for everybody from, say, Christopher Wren to someone who doesn't have a tomb yet, William Blake, which I think would be a fun design project, a tomb for William Blake. What about a tomb for Albert Einstein? And so the ideas, though, came really from, they obviously came from Lebbeus and a whole morass of influences that he didn't get into. But the idea that Arthur C. Clarke is a kind of originary moment for that design project, I think is really quite exciting. And then another example, I think, is someone who I've been speaking about a lot during lectures is China Mieville, the science fiction novelist here in London. And he's got a short story about, the exact title escapes me, but I think it's a report of certain events in London. And the idea is that streets appear and reappear throughout London, and that in the middle of the night there's suddenly a new street cutting through the middle of Mayfair, and then it's not there again in 3 days, or suddenly a street disappears, and the city is this constantly kind of shifting temporary network of infrastructures that are no longer there or reappear again 2 days later. But what is interesting about that is it's fiction, it's science fiction, it's fantasy, it's whatever you want to call it, it's urban sci-fi. But also it has a kind of analytic power that maybe even just a description of the city that it comes out of the geography department at UCL might not have. And it has a kind of, I guess you could say, an allegorical resonance that lends itself to describing the city, whether it's the modern city and its proclivity for having certain streets reappearing or disappearing, like, say, Haussmannized Paris, or you're talking about slums where streets can reappear or streets can disappear and appear overnight. the sort of shanties will move into the street, colonize it, and there's no street there anymore. Meanwhile, people tear down these houses and you have another street, etc. It's interesting then that China Mieville short story can be used as a kind of analytic template for talking about these things, and that you can use science fiction in an incredibly practical, analytic way, and it isn't just some sort of some masturbatory fantasy that someone has in their bedroom writing about sci-fi worlds of the future. And I think it's worth asking again, and hopefully this will come up later when we talk about some canonical aspects of this. Why isn't China Mieville in architectural history books? Why do we read about, say, you can read about Wes Jones, but you can't read about China Mieville. You read about Eric Owen Moss, but you don't read about, for that matter, Ian MacLeod. Like, where are these people in architectural history? I would personally argue that there's every reason in the world to open up the bounds of what we consider architecture and include these people in there in a way that they are imaginative resources for architects to draw from. Just because they don't have an MArch doesn't mean that they're not part of the conversation, or that they aren't, in fact. Like Arthur C. Clarke arguably should be in, say, Charles Jenks' History of 20th Century Architecture, but he isn't. So why is that? Or even as another, for instance, Simon Sadler's History of ARCA Graham. For me, at least, maybe I'm unique in this, but it never mentions J G, or I don't think at least it ever mentions J G Ballard. Personally, I think that that's odd. I mean, I think that there's a sort of a Ballardian resonance to a lot of ARCA Grahamian projects, and he's not mentioned in that sort of history of ARCA Graham. So why not? Is there a place for novelists in architectural history? And again, I think it's exciting that we can actually talk about this today. So anyway, there's several examples that could go on. As just another example, I think Rupert Thompson is actually, I think, is an unbelievably good writer, and he's got a relatively underrated novel called Divided Kingdom that I think didn't get the appreciation that it deserved. But what's exciting about that is that if you go into the acknowledgments and you read sort of Rupert Thompson's influences, one of the books he cites as influencing Divided Kingdom is Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large. And when you sort of push a little bit further and you do a little bit more research into this, what's kind of exciting is that Divided Kingdom, in some ways, this is a bit reductive, but it's basically a novelization of Rem Koolhaas's graduate thesis, of Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. And that to me is something that should enter into architectural discussion. What does it mean if, say, you just did a graduate project here, or your thesis project at the AA, and somebody in 15 years comes along and writes a novel based on your project? Is that the fulfillment of your imaginative program? Or are you being ripped off, or what's the relationship between what you design as an architect and sort of future fictive possibilities of that design? Can people come along and make a film based on your architecture project here at the AA or at the Bartlett or at Columbia, et cetera, et cetera? And so just a couple of, a few other things that I think are interesting, and that I'm afraid maybe wouldn't come up if I don't mention them. I'm interested in the idea that you precisely can find narrative, and you can find stories, and you can find ideas in architectural projects. And kind of a lame example is when I was about 13 or 11 or so, I read the novelization of the film The Abyss. It's a James Cameron movie, and it was turned into a novel. But so this kind of thing happens all the time in different fields. You can have a movie and someone will write a novel based on it, or you can have a novel and someone will turn it into a movie. But very rarely, at least as far as I'm aware, does someone take, say, a Christopher Wren building and novelize it, turn it into a novel, or write a novel based on that structure. Or for that matter, rarely does someone take a novel and transform that into an architectural work. And something I was just thinking about this morning is, what if you found out that, say, James Joyce didn't write Ulysses after Dublin existed, but Dublin was built as a sort of 3D representation of Ulysses, and that Dublin actually came later? Now, what would happen if you could take Ulysses and plug it into a 3D printer? What would you get? What if you got the city of Dublin? What are the relationships between fiction and architecture, and how can you translate from one to the other and back again, and how can you turn one into the other, and how could you novelize a work of architecture, or film someone's graduate process or project, etc. So anyways, I just think it's exciting to look at these possible overlaps, and not only from the standpoint of just sort of sheer ideas, and you're at a party and you want to talk about something cool, to the idea that maybe you have an alternative career. You're being trained as an architect now, but if all the clients go away and no one's hiring you, what else can you do? Well, maybe you can get into cinema. After all, you're being taught the same things that, with the same software packages that a lot of people that do film editing are using now. You have a whole incredible amount of video games, as hopefully Jim will be discussing during the Q&As. There are all these kind of alternative, almost like a rhizome, so to speak, of careers that are open to architects and architectural speculation. And that's something that I hope we'll be talking about today. So having said all that, I'll be turning over now to Peter Cook from ARCA Graham, and we'll see where he goes with the general theme of science fiction and architecture. Let me say that Peter apparently has to leave relatively quickly after his talk, so we'll do a short Q&A immediately preceding him, and then we'll have to say goodbye before we transition over to Victor. But the general themes of today are hopefully everything from cinema to games to science fiction to architecture to novelization to the software packages that are used across different fields to ancient history to myth to religion and so on. So hopefully all of these things will come up throughout the day. And again, feel free to ask questions, write things down, and also take advantage of the Wi-Fi network and put things out if you want to. So anyway, with that sort of a huge mess of ideas, I'll turn this over to Peter. And so please welcome Peter Cook.
I'm sorry I'm doing it very crowdedly today, and that was a great introduction. There are lots and lots and lots of things. I'll have to find an excuse to have a few beers with you sometime and really follow on because there were certain things raised about, and I think the particular one I would home in on is the question of the cut-off points between not only architecture and literature, but and science fiction and real science. That I think in the days of ARCA Graham, we always, we were very architectural. Some of us were, anyhow. And that actually we felt there was no dividing line between what ought to be regular architecture and our architecture, and equally no dividing line between the sort of full-on scheme and the half-on scheme and the could-be-built scheme and the fictive thing, and it was all stuff. And I'm somebody who, I suppose, for good or ill, I felt that almost when you were talking that there's a parallel with what I think happened in modern architecture and the sort of reputational aspect of modern architecture, which was the sort of Bauhaus position and the rational positions, got a lot of mileage. And meanwhile, there was some weird shit characters doing expressionism and funny things that people didn't like and stuff, which has tended to be considered as a secondary stream. And what you're suggesting, what I think might be implicit in this morning, is that the secondary stream might be actually more interesting than the stuff that does get published all the time. But I'm already digressing. I do tend to wear my heart on my sleeve, but today I have the unique opportunity of wearing my heart on my stomach, because there are some people in Taiwan and elsewhere who seem to be producing things that talk about this stuff. When one started doing these things, and this is a very early ARCA Graham project that I did with the model by Dennis, it was even pre-Plug-in City. It was anticipating Plug-in City, and it was a kind of jackdaw operation. One was gleaning bits from Buckminster Fuller, one was sticking strange things in the sky, one was interested in the idea of the diagonal, and then it got formalized around something called ARCA Graham. And that had many manifestations. The more interesting stage, in a way, which was less formalized, was when one started speculating on the possibility that you could try to summarize certain issues, certain atmospheres, certain dreams, certain, if you like, physical or psychological sensations. And what the hell would you do to make that possible? And one wrote books. So in this, which was my second very early book, called Experimental Architecture, with a horrible cover, but all these funny guys, Doreen Dugdale, Metabolis, Nair Group from Russia, Pichler, they were sort of hovering in and out of architecture. Some of them weren't even architects, but nonetheless like Walter Pichler. But hovering in and out, and some were sort of great old heroes of ours like Waxman, and people that you, like you're doing with your book, people who you meet by publishing them, and then the person turns into a face behind a glass or something sometime later. But there was no dividing line between Friedrichs and Florian in that book, who was then dealing with lasers and that sort of atmospheric thing, who later then did sort of kind of Pomo shopping centres in Providence, Rhode Island, which, that's another story. And I think that we live, a lot of the things that we were talking about in ARCA Graham, bits of building, extending this. I go about, 6 6 times a week at the moment through one of these pieces of building extending to another. In fact, it's 3 buildings. You know, there's a building off the screen to the right, which is a sort of usually rather plonky, solid building. There's this building, which sort of moves. And, of course, there's the building that's sitting at the end of it, which will take you to another building. And in my warped mind, there's no dividing line between any of them. They reciprocally need each other. Whether that's fiction, no. Whether it's what might at that time, when we started ARCA Graham, be considered sort of on the edge, certainly was considered to be outside the normal sphere of the architectural vocabulary. And that's really the central issue. The Mobot, which David Green, in one of the ARCA Graham, banged on about, this particular Mobot sits on the top of the Oslo Architecture School. It mows, the robot, it mows the lawn. Trouble is, inside the Oslo Architecture School, they're doing very, very straight up and down buildings, as if nothing has resonated, as if the young architects inside say, well, that's just mowing the lawn. Whereas to David and everybody, it was a magic possibility. It was a wonderful thing. It would change your life. I can argue that maybe mowing the lawn doesn't change your life. But I certainly, therefore, you know, propositions such as this, which was a sort of almost a flick of the wrist scheme done in about an afternoon, probably where the colouring took longer than the drawing, but where one said, look, we've got Hovercraft, and we whiz about, and we want to do things and go places, and we have inflatables, so why not? And I did actually manage to do a little bit of pop-up architecture some years later in Frankfurt, very modestly, but now one says, maybe not exactly the same configuration, but of course that can be done, you know. And there's always a phrase that the late Warren Chalk used to use, taken out of the Daily Mirror advert for a bodybuilding system. Sounds a bit sexist today, but in fact, the point being, the ad showed a sort of 3-stone weakling or something, and then the next photo showed this guy with muscles, and it said, "Men, it can be done." And I think that still remains, thanks to Warren, a theme of all this. Men, it can be done. Mike Webb not only started with the cushicle, but the cushicle rapidly, you know, I think there's also this thing of things that are easily comprehensible, things that are a bit spooky, a bit mixed, a bit not pure, because in all forms of architecture, we tend to favour the pure, the easily identifiable, the, God help to use the word iconic, that which can be summarised. Whereas really a lot of the interesting speculations between architecture and grasped idea, literature, funky stuff, new ways with soap, whatever it might be, is that they don't fall into an easily describable territory. This is maybe part, I mean, I'm sure Mike ought to be here to talk about it, but it's partly robot, it's partly electrics, it's something to do with chassis, it's something to do with people, it's something to do with glasses, it's something to do with what you stick on your foot, it's something to do with something that wobbles, and more and more and more and more. It does not, you know, classicism, or what it is this convenience thing, so that the boring students in the Oslo School of Architecture sit there with a sort of, you know, minimalist version of classicism, and the Mobot zuzzes about above their heads. It makes me weep, actually. And then, of course, you get fixed futurism. I mean, you know, I'm a great crony of Wolf Pricks, and yet he wants to make, of course, a heroic object. To what extent this is fictive? At one time, something like that, and if you saw it in the Chernikov 101 Fantasies or something, you'd say, that's a fictive thing. We haven't seen anything like it. Now you can build it. You can go on a public school in Los Angeles. Perfectly okay. So that's another thing that somebody, probably the oldest person in the room, I'm not quite sure, is that, you know, these things are absorbed and then they're in the vernacular, and then are they out of the vernacular again? Because people get a bit, even something like this, which is actually, by my standards, fairly straight up and down, they get worried about it. Why do we need it? And all the moralist crap kicks in. And so that the trickling tower, which I think another issue which, if one was taking a longer time over it, one would start to talk about the moment, the degree to which a project or an idea or an experience or a mechanism, etc., 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 exists within a moment or is part of an ongoing kind of theatre of conditions. And I often find myself describing work and projects in terms of the theatre of the situation. We existed. My day today has already had 2 or 3 episodes of theatre, you know, going in the studio, coming in a cab, waiting for this thing to start, suddenly hearing somebody who I haven't met before say some things which really, really I'm kind of wanting to cheer and agree, and then I've got to find, as I say, an opportunity to have a couple of beers with him and talk about it. Sometimes one does things which appear to be provocative, I suppose, deliberately naughty, but actually talking about Louie Cohn. I spent part of 2 days ago in a crit in Sweden, and we were discussing at great length Louie Cohn for reasons that I won't go into. And this armature was actually a reflection upon the Richards Laboratory in Philadelphia, which for my generation was an extremely important statement. It doesn't look like the Richards Laboratory, and it has memories of ARCA Graham. It's after the ARCA Graham period. It has anticipations of the use of vapor. In fact, the important thing about it was that it was to do with the use of vapor. Or the important thing about this project from the 80s was that the cactus, which you see, the mechanical cactus, which you see on the right-hand side, in later stages of the same project, takes over the whole thing. And actually the cactus is the most important part of the vocabulary of the architecture. And that, in a sense, is a sort of self-provocation, but also a test. I thought that it also has overtones, because the project was called Way Out West Berlin. At that time, it was still just West Berlin, East Berlin. And the money for West Berlin came from the West, came from the United States. But it was also me making a kind of dig at the East Coast of the United States, which is always the uptight part, which has had most mileage in the AA. Whereas the West is where there's something else much more macabre, much more weird shit. And the cactus is, of course, you know, the thing what grows in the West. And God was clearly on holiday when he invented the cactus, you know, because in any decent school of architecture it would be failed for you know, insufficient junction conditions. And then there are people out there. In fact, I'm going to use this opportunity to propose something which I have done privately in a number of restaurants and bars throughout the world in the last 2 months, which is to suggest that somewhere, then where Brett's left the room, but somewhere we should hold the first Weird Shit Architecture Conference. Because there's some wonderful, you know, not just of my generation, but for many generations, some wonderful stuff out there. Now, at the moment, the capital of the weird shit architecture movement happens to be in Winnipeg, for reasons I will describe later. The head of the School of Architecture at Winnipeg is a guy called Nat Chard, who happens to be a displaced Englishman, and this is his project, one of his projects. If you have an architect, a respectable university architecture school, directed by a professor who's already been a professor in somewhere as uptight as Denmark, producing weird shit like that, then you might be on the roll. Something might be happening. Something might just be happening out there. Or another gentleman who, forgive me for mentioning a number of people sort of associated with the other school up the other end of Bloomsbury, called the Bartlett, but I won't mention it again. Dr. Marian Colletti, this is he before receiving his doctorate, when he was first our student, having got off the plane from Innsbruck, producing a project which was based upon animals on the head, which needed, he's gone bald since then anyhow, but he, maybe because there were too many animals on his head, required the placing of a Velcro pad and then the addition of the animals for various intellectual reasons, which he then spent the next 5 years developing until somebody gave him a doctorate. His great friend Marcos Cruz, who's also Dr. Marcos Cruz now, spent a parallel period investigating what happens when you put naughty things in skins, including people in the skin of the building, developing that over the next 5 or 7 years until somebody gave him a doctorate for the purpose. These guys are responsible academics, ladies and gentlemen. They're out there in the great unspoken weird shit academy. And I would include amongst those somebody who is familiar to this house, Hernan Diaz Alonso. And I was lucky enough in Sweden in the last 3 days to be on a jury with a group of people, interestingly, some based in Kentucky, some based in Pratt, some based in God knows where. All of us were on a jury, coincidentally, where it has emerged that Hernan Diaz Alonso is already second generation, meaning he has his kids out there. And although he's thought of as a sort of correct person, old school, cigar, wife, normal life, but also is actually an unregistered member of the Weird Shit International. And I find that very interesting because he links into the smart-ass circuit, the kind of correct parametric circuit, which you have here in London. But he's on the really more of a weird shitter, I think, than he's a correct. Or as of course is Marcos Novak, who always is one of those people who everybody's not quite sure about, but has actually a brilliant analytic mind. I've been on juries with him again in Sweden, where he is able to discuss straight up and down architecture extremely succinctly. Now, just at this moment, halfway through, I should peel off and do another. There's several of these. You won't see my fat, hairy stomach. Don't worry, no problem. This is, of course, where you take yourself with you. You return to your hometown and dump your weird shit on the cliff. I think what's interesting about one or two of these characters as I pass through them is that they come out of the Nat Chards and the Marcos Cruzes and the Marcos Novaks and so on. They come out of straight architecture. They choose to move into these territories. They pursue them, but they have the ability to relate back. I think what the sort of enemy camp find difficult is, and I will be 19th century about it, say it is an enemy camp. I'm standing here in a room where perhaps, in generations before mine, they would be discussing the classical position or the romantic position. And I think it's still the same as that. I think there is still hardline Marxist Miesian parametrics, without mentioning names. And there are people who do just as interesting parametrics who are weird shitters, who see a connection between something that grows out of your foot and might turn into a turnip and, something that might enclose a city or be a city or whatever. I think it's sort of, maybe one's being sort of local about this. I think it even stretches, certainly somebody like C.J. Lim, though he's not strictly speaking a weird shitter and is now doing proper cities. Nonetheless, a lot of his influences have come as much from Zaha, but as much from the weird shit territory. He's been, after all, a close friend of many of the people I'm talking about. Or names that you probably won't have heard of, a guy, I don't know what even has happened to him, a guy called Matthias Osterhager, where perhaps it's borrowed from the engine of a Fiat car, perhaps it's borrowed from, ways of passing sun through chemical paper, but it has a certain sort of scatter. So I'm being very architectural with this stuff. Or another guy, Julian Kruger, whose project, this project, when you actually saw it, was mostly to do with smoke again. Not so much, the apparatus is to do with the creation of an atmosphere of smoke, and it is the smoke which is the key part of the theatre of the architecture. Albeit that, therefore, when we get from sort of science fiction into science into mechanics, inevitably you get this dichotomy, which is where the armatures and the bits and pieces sometimes look a little bit passé, or they're simply the only way that you can pump some sort of stuff through a pipe and it comes out where you want it to, except in the best of the juries of projects like these, when the outside jury comes in, it doesn't quite work. And you always say, well, it was working last Thursday. And then irritatingly, the guy, you meet him in the street, says, it worked the Tuesday afterwards. Problem was it didn't work on the Friday morning. But, you know, I think what I'm saying is that this is where, in the early days, one was interested to do a book called Experimental Architecture, because there is, again, not even a fine line, there is no line between the notion of experiment and proposal and imagination. I think what I'm really talking about is imagination. And one is returning now to more circumspect rendition produced by the Victoria and Albert Museum, therefore it's more circumspect, where it returns to being a proposition about the placement of objects. And after all, I'm surprisingly, a working architect where the placement of objects become important. Another mysterious lady who went back to Canada and God knows what happened to her, Annika Meseros, in a project here, covered the Venice Lido with an amalgam of materials. And by working with the biophysics guys at UCL, actually got the chemical mix right, as far as I know. It ends up, and the model's sort of suppurated. So, and I think this is an area that Marcus Cruz is very interested in, where the propositions sometimes get into sort of not just spooky, but quite considerably distasteful territory. I think that's what I was on about with that sort of reinterpretation of Louie Cohn, which is that taste taste is somehow linked to the careful, the circumspect, the reasonable, the good egg, the pensionable mind. Whereas weird shit needs a certain amount of tease. It's arguable, he says, putting on his correct academic hat, that if you just do a tease after tease after tease after tease, it's tedious. But there is, you know, or around this really point raised by you, there is the question of provocation, of pushing the edges. I think if architecture stops pushing the edges, we might as well pack up and leave it to the computers completely and go home and do something more rewarding. I can't remember who did this one, but I was from up the road, and it's got animals living inside tubes. I put that in also, you know, as a politically incorrect, which I think is also important. I suspect that the wonderful Weird Shit conference that we might hold one day would contain certain propositions that would be politically incorrect, because political correctness, from where I come from, is again, it suits the circumspect, the reasonable, the pensionable, etc. Sometimes one finds oneself doing funny things because somebody's going to pay one to do it quickly, and you don't stop long enough to be a good boy. And that was something I did for a publication a year or so ago. There's an idea there that's more interesting than the drawing, which was, I suppose, is the proposition of the alien society, that if you had a city, that perhaps it quite deliberately exists in a dangerous jungle, an alien society. When you go to somewhere like Sao Paulo, for example, and you look at some of the, you know, the more bourgeois buildings of Sao Paulo, some of which are rather good, you know that just outside the gate is somebody who might knife you, certainly will rob you, certainly will spit at the wall, certainly lives in a desperate and uncomfortable situation. And maybe in parts of the world that will increase. I'm not sure what I'm saying quite here, but that, you know, science fiction architecture might also be a proposition involving the desperateness of the society. Now I'm sounding hair shirt, but I'm not hair shirt really, because I sort of rather enjoy it. And it could even have an organization. I tend to be the sort of person who draws the funny drawing first and then backtracks. You know, the next drawing to this will be completely correctly to scale. And you might find that the turning circles are... In fact, it was always very funny when we were doing ARCA Graham. I sort of digress into architecture now. I used to get irritated that the French projects and the Italian projects didn't have handrails and the escalators would never work. And if you look carefully at sort of Ron's drawings or my drawings, the escalators were actually at 35 degrees with a 5-foot overrun because that's how they work. And it didn't, I don't think it inhibited the rest. You know, in other words, one's saying in a sense, it matters tremendously that these things connect, because it's all too easy to say, oh, those are sort of arty wankers and we're real architects, you know? And that the connection does exist is very, very important. And so it is possible that the Veg Village could have working drawings produced for it, and certain, you know, like David Green's issue of ARCA Graham had a packet of seeds. My Veg Village could have a gardening specification and how many gallons of water per month, and you know, what kind of neoprene gasket. It could all be related. Just take a bit of time. And so the Comifo Veg House, which appears in the publication I shall mention right at the end and elsewhere, is something where I'm tracking quite recently, maybe in the last few months, tracking back over certain ideas and still trying to think of their combination. I fall back on the only way of doing it I know. I can't do it on the computer. I can do it with ink and paint and stuff, which is to suggest that the vegetal, the comfortable, the enclosing, the message giving, the kind of what's going on in the corner conditions can be linked. It is just that correct architecture tends to like them separated into different worlds. And I think that's another issue, which is the degree to which, you know, the writer's imagination, and sometimes the filmmaker's imagination, and sometimes the dramatist's imagination, sometimes the composer's imagination can move across. My son, who seems to do a lot of writing of music on the computer, has no worry about plucking the string of a real cello, stretching it digitally, working over it with something that hasn't had a string plucked or a thing tapped, and then doing something else with it and getting somebody to sing over it. I mean, and architecture, I suppose, is more expensive and more difficult and more heavy, but what I'm really saying is that this breaking of boundary is, I think, what science fiction, science fact architecture is about. In a drawing, which I'm just about to go and see hung up this morning, which I hope Brett will give me the opportunity of talking about at greater length in a few months' time, albeit to say that its proposition is that there are strange, non-existent dividing lines, that there are pieces that remain, even in the mind of the author, which is me, neither animal, vegetable, or mineral, neither tectonic nor natural, but a kind of self-tease. It's difficult because, you know, one is using symbolism. If something is straight and repeats, the implication is that it's manufactured or created. The kind of logjam down a Canadian river is an interesting case here because the log was cut, but what might happen to it down the river is only semi-predictable, and one sometimes uses the discussion of the use of vegetation, the architectural use of vegetation, as having those same characteristics, that man can control it to a degree, and then it, by its nature, will do something that is less than predictable. And then there are naughty bits. You recognize them coming from the jungle. There are naughty bits which are, in a sense, both a self-provocation and maybe a provocation to others. And I deliberately put this one on, and this is my last layer, we celebrated 5 years of the building, and you notice it's a rather more circumspect T-shirt. The figure is not only distilled, it's not an exact working drawing of the building, it's a distilled graphicized, and it's placed pleasantly. And as I'm just about to head off to the Royal Academy, I might even dare wear it in the boozy lunch that we're just about to have when we look at our drawings. But I'm making the rather arrogant presumption that many people in this room know this, at least from books, this project. But I chose this photograph of the many I have because of the crap in the foreground. You know, here, this is not just something that's a nice drawing, not a nice drawing that, God help us, miraculously won the competition, and somehow by using crap techniques got built. But it has not only landed, but it's landed in the world that we know, the world of car parking signs and somebody's, you know, parking their bike and litter bins. And that, to me, says something more than if I just showed you an art shot taken for Domus or something, which is to say that it has arrived. And that is that, you know, whether it's science fiction, architecture or not, some people think it is, I don't know, it's relevant, but let's say that for the arguments of today, it's in the conversation. The fact that it's there with the ordinary world, and if you stand in the wrong place in the middle of the winter, a bloody great block of snow falls on your head, which we, you know, but you put a rope up, no problem. If you're stupid enough to stand under it, tough shit. I mean, that's the old arrogant architect, but I love the fact that it is in the real world. And my final picture is produced. The same architecture school that my friend Nat Chard is running is now, thanks to him, producing a magazine which came on my desk yesterday. And there it is, dead on arrival. Knowing Nat and his psychology, there's more to be said around that. But it's full of weird, it not only has the Comfort Veg house, it has Mike Webb reworking the Furniture Manufacturers Association after 51 years, reworking it, doing another new drawing on it. It has Eben Douglas inside it. It has Mark West and a whole lot of people who either teach there or have visited there. It is at the moment, temporarily, the capital of the Weird Shit International Conference of Architecture. And I rest my case on, I hope, an optimistic note, that the fire hasn't gone out. It's not entirely in the hands of the 70-year-olds. It's also, there are kids out there doing this stuff. There have been little streams of continuity. And I hope it's not just repeating itself. I think that the world that's out there and the techniques that are available, I'm waiting for the bar of soap that becomes the ultimate environment that I can just do that with, and it happens. Because a lot of the other stuff has happened, so why not that? That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. I don't know if that's on. It looks like we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so for questions. And so Liam's got another microphone, and he can walk around and give it to anyone who wants to ask. I just kind of lead off. One of the things I think is exciting is that my first sort of experience of ARCA Graham, and even just sort of the whole sort of, I guess you could just say the whole sort of avant-garde 60s and 70s type thing is the megastructure. It's the idea that there's this gigantic intervention in the city. You know, the walking city trundles in, or you build some sort of huge dome over Manhattan. But this gigantic scale architectural intervention comes along. But what I think is actually interesting, both just speaking to you for the Building Blog book, but also watching your talk, is that it's actually maybe these other moments. It's things like people who manufacture umbrellas. It's the Mobot. It's the bar of soap. It's maybe the TV remote control. it's a very small sort of a technical or spatial intervention that actually opens up these new spatial possibilities. So I guess I'm wondering if you can just talk about that, that idea that it isn't necessarily the full city megastructure that comes along and sort of fulfills these architectural fantasies. That maybe it's something as simple as a new bar of soap.
Well, I mean, with the reservation, I might change my mind tomorrow. I also find the megastructure a bit boring. I mean, I've been at it for a long time, but every 10 years I find the megastructure very boring. Then I kind of come back to it for a bit, like I did at Kawasaki Information City in the 80s, which was the first time I dared return to the megastructure. I got bored with it again, and at the moment I'm bored with it. And I say bar of soap because I like taking something which seems an unlikely starting point, like the cactus. I think it would be a wonderful challenge for somebody to sort of set a competition where they said, right, boiled egg, urbanism, and see what happens. Whereas usually they say, megastructure urbanism or noily plan urbanism or, and then, okay, yes, we know where it's going to go. Whereas if you go boiled egg in miniature, you see, is too easy. But boiled egg to city, now investigate. But, having said that, I reserve the right on, Thursday the 15th to say, well, I'm really into the megastructure. Suddenly I had a new idea sitting on the loo.
Another question. I think that there's so much speculation about, or at least amongst architecture students and fellow architecture bloggers and my friends, who's the next ARCA Graham? Where's the next ARCA Graham coming? But I think it's actually interesting maybe to totally reverse that question and say, who was the ARCA Graham of 3,000 years ago? Where was ARCA Graham on the plains of Central Asia in 4500 BC? I'm wondering if you see these sort of distant radical ancestors that don't come out of, say, early 20th century or late 19th century, but going back to, I mentioned Angkor Wat in my opener, but
I had big problems because I lived in Norwich when I was a child, and I collected castles and cathedrals. And once you've lived in a town that has 40 medieval churches, you get to the age of 16, at the point at which I started being an architecture student, and you're actually bored by it. You are by definition bored by anything historical. And I had to get over that. It's probably taken about 40 years to get over that antipathy. And occasionally you do go out there and find something that's from some period of, you say, they had a good idea there. I'm not a great historian, and I do admit that both when I was at school, before architecture school, and during my architectural studies and since, I sort of come alive at about 1820, maybe even 1880, sort of 18-something onwards, it sort of resonates. Before that, it's old shit. I'm sorry, I have a very simple mind. I had great difficulty with stuff that's before about 18-something rather, because, they weren't using drills, and I don't know what it is. It doesn't resonate. And there is loads of stuff out there. You can't do everything. I don't ride a bicycle either,
The question in the audience there?
Sorry, Peter. Does that even include things outside of architecture? So
To a large extent, yes. I have to admit that I used to go and see lots and lots of progressive movies when I was, 20 and stuff, and I used to go to the theatre, and I got bored with it. I can't. I'm too selfish. I like concerts and ballet because I can think my own thoughts. But as soon as somebody's yakking at you and you've got to go through their thoughts, it gets in the way. Yeah, lovely. But I'm really, I'm bearing, I'm not going to bear beyond this, but I'm bearing certain foibles that I probably am an architecture bore. Sort of.
If there's not another question, there was a short description from I think it was Goethe who went to Rome and saw the burning of the Colosseum and the smoke coming out of the Colosseum walls. And my friend Alex Trevi, who writes a blog called Pruned, which is an excellent landscape architecture blog, basically described described Goethe's description of the burning of the Colosseum and the smoke coming through the arches as the Blur building of 1781, or whatever the year might be. But you never know where these sort of unexpected and strange sort of avant-garde moments might erupt unexpectedly.
Well, I'm going to end up on a very fusty note, which is that there is a restaurant in above the town of El Escorial, which is, of course, dominated by this great famous monastery, this big thing. And the story is, and I've been to this restaurant, I was told that Alvar Aalto, when taken to the restaurant, deliberately turned his chair away from Escorial because he didn't like that kind of thing. Which makes you think. Okay.
All right, cool. Thanks, Peter.
Must fly.